There comes a time in many people's lives when they look back and feel as though the best years of their life have already passed. For some, this feeling is accompanied by a nagging sense that love, too, has eluded them as the years have gone by. The youthful spark, the intense passion, and the romance that once came so easily seem distant, replaced by the comfortable, yet often lonely rhythms of older age. This was the reality for an older man named Thomas, who, after decades of experience in love and life, found himself unexpectedly swept off his feet by a woman whose charm, beauty, and youthful energy made him feel alive again. At first, everything seemed perfect. It was as though fate had granted him a second chance at experiencing the magic of youth, igniting a passion he thought was long gone. But as time passed, what initially felt like a revitalizing force in his life began to reveal itself as a more complicated, painful journey, one that would force him to confront his own sense of self-worth and the true meaning of love. The spark of passion, an enchantment beyond years. In the beginning, it was as if a spell had been cast upon him. When she entered his life, it was with the subtle grace of someone who knew exactly how to make an impression. Her every word was a delicate whisper, her touch gentle yet electrifying. She made him feel special in a way he hadn't experienced in years, if not decades. She showered him with praise, compliments that seemed so genuine they felt like a lifeline, pulling him in closer. She made him feel like the most important man in the world. He was no longer the aging, forgotten man who had watched the world pass him by. She saw something in him, something worth loving, and that made him feel vibrant, full of life once again. Her admiration was intoxicating, and it wasn't long before he was entranced by her, eagerly seeking her approval with every gesture and word. He began to rediscover a vitality he thought had long faded with time. In her eyes, he was no longer the older man with wrinkles and graying hair. He was a man of strength, vigor, and potential. The confidence he had once carried so effortlessly in his youth seemed to return in full force, as if the years were rolling back with every smile she gave him. She made him feel needed, desired, wanted. Every effort he made to please her was met with rewards. A touch, a kiss, a soft word of encouragement. It was a delicate dance of validation, one that had him believing that maybe, just maybe, the best was yet to come. For the first time in a long while, he felt as though he could conquer the world. She turned every act of kindness he gave her into a grand gesture of devotion, elevating him to a pedestal he had never expected to stand on again. The shift from adoration to expectation. However, as the weeks turned into months, the initial glow began to fade. The admiration he had once received in abundance slowly diminished, replaced by something more subtle yet more unsettling: expectations. The affection that had once been so pure and innocent began to feel transactional, as though every smile and word of praise came with a price. It started with little things, suggestions, hints about his physical health, his appearance, his fitness. At first they seemed innocent enough. She would smile and playfully tell him that he should take better care of himself, that men his age shouldn't be so physically limited. He took it in stride, believing that she simply wanted him to feel good about himself, to stay healthy. After all, what harm could there be in caring about one's health? He agreed, telling himself that perhaps she was just looking out for him. But as time went on, these gentle suggestions became more frequent, more insistent. She began to criticize him more openly, even in the most subtle ways. Her comments about his age, his physical limitations, and his energy levels became less veiled, more pointed. She no longer whispered her concerns with a smile, but spoke them as if they were facts, dismissing his efforts with a sense of growing impatience. Where once he had felt like a young man again, now he was constantly reminded of his age. He tried to ignore the sting of her words, but they began to wear him down. The man who once felt like a king now felt like a servant, struggling to meet the demands of a woman who seemed to see only what he lacked rather than what he could offer. The struggle. Proving his worth. As the emotional distance between them grew, he found himself more and more desperate to prove his worth. The validation that had once come so easily now felt like a far-off dream. No matter what he did, it was never enough. He worked harder, tried to be more attentive, more passionate, more energetic, but nothing seemed to change. She always found something more to criticize, something more to demand. Every word she said about his age, every comparison to younger men, felt like a direct attack on his dignity. He had once prided himself on his experience, his wisdom, and his emotional depth. But now it seemed that none of that mattered to her. All she wanted was the vigor of youth, the energy of someone half his age. He tried to tell himself that this was just a phase, that if he tried hard enough, she would see the man he truly was. One day, in a rare moment of vulnerability, he spoke to her about the deeper things he could offer, a connection that went beyond physical energy, something that came with age and experience. He tried to show her that he could still be everything she needed, if only she would see past the surface. But instead of understanding, she laughed at him. Her laughter was like a knife to his soul, and in that moment, he realized that he had been living in a fantasy. She didn't see him for who he was, she saw only what he lacked. The breaking point, an awakening of self-worth. It wasn't just her youth that had him captivated. It was the illusion that if he just tried hard enough, he could win her love and approval. He stayed in a relationship that slowly eroded his sense of self-worth, all because he believed that love was worth any sacrifice, even at the expense of his own dignity. But one night, something inside him shifted. After yet another cruel exchange, he stood before the mirror, looking at his reflection for what felt like the first time in years. The face staring back at him was older, yes, but it was also wiser. The lines on his face told the story of a life well lived, a life filled with love, loss, joy, and pain. And for the first time, he saw those lines not as signs of weakness, but as symbols of strength. The heaviness in his eyes was not a sign of defeat. It was the weight of experience, of someone who had lived through it all and had come out the other side. He realized in that moment that he had been seeking validation from the wrong person. He had been so focused on gaining her approval that he had neglected to show himself the love and respect he so desperately needed. He had been living in the shadow of her criticism, sacrificing his own worth for the sake of someone who could not appreciate him for who he truly was. The decision, embracing self-love. In that quiet moment, standing before the mirror, Thomas made a decision that would change his life forever. He would no longer allow his worth to be determined by someone else. He would no longer seek approval from a person who could not see the man he had become. He would no longer allow his self-love to be a quiet, hidden feeling. He would express it, protect it, and honor it. He realized that true love doesn't demand sacrifices that diminish the soul. True love doesn't make you feel less than what you are. It doesn't demand that you change who you are in order to be loved. And so, with newfound clarity and strength, he let go of the relationship that had once promised so much, but had ultimately cost him his dignity. Reclaiming his dignity, a moment of liberation. It needed to be said, loud and unapologetic. It wasn't just a conversation, it was a turning point, a moment of clarity that had been building up for years. He had reached a threshold where silence could no longer serve him, where meekness no longer felt like an option. He had allowed himself to be diminished for far too long, but not anymore. This was the moment he was going to reclaim the parts of himself that had been lost, forgotten, along the way. It was time to step into his truth, no matter the pain or the potential fallout. The weight of the words. The next day, as he sat across from her, a sense of foreboding filled the air. His heart raced with anxiety, yet it wasn't fear that gripped him. It was a fierce, quiet strength that refused to be ignored. His voice, though steady, carried a newfound conviction. "I'm leaving," he said, each word ringing clear and unshakable. There was a stillness in the room, almost suffocating. She looked at him, stunned, her eyes wide with disbelief. She hadn't expected him to summon the courage to finally speak up, to stand his ground in a way that was so definitive. After all, for years, he had been the quiet one, the passive one, the one who quietly endured the harshness of their dynamic without ever really challenging it. The roles they had settled into were so deeply ingrained that this sudden shift took her by complete surprise. But he was no longer the man who had put up with hurtful words, the man who had sacrificed his dignity to keep the peace. In this moment, he was someone new, a man who had learned the painful yet necessary lesson of self-respect. He was finally standing up for himself in a way he hadn't been able to for far too long. "I love myself too much to allow this to continue," he continued, his voice now firmer, a sense of self-worth echoing in every syllable. "I won't be humiliated anymore, not by you, not by anyone." The moment the words left his mouth, he felt an internal shift, as if the weight that had held him down for so long was starting to lift. He felt lighter. The chains that had bound him, emotionally, mentally, were beginning to loosen. There was a profound surge of self-respect flowing through his veins, empowering him in a way he had never known before. The shock and silence. She didn't immediately respond. Her silence hung in the air like a thick fog, full of confusion, anger, and perhaps a touch of fear. He could see it in her face. She hadn't expected this. For years, she had assumed he would continue to bear the weight of her harsh words and behavior, that he would always remain compliant, always willing to sacrifice his own sense of worth to maintain the relationship. But now, this very assumption was being shattered, leaving her stunned and, in some ways, vulnerable. He realized that he had become the very thing she hadn't expected, a man who could assert himself, who had finally found the courage to speak his truth. She had always underestimated him, mistaking his quiet nature for weakness. But she was wrong, as he knew now. He wasn't weak. He wasn't the compliant man he had once been. He was strong, strong enough to walk away from something that had drained him, something that no longer served him, to the liberation within. As he spoke those words, something amazing began to stir within him. It wasn't just a declaration to her, it was a personal reclamation, a rediscovery of his own worth, his identity, and his dignity. For the first time in years, he felt proud of the man he saw in the mirror. The reflection staring back at him was no longer one of resignation, but of someone who had finally learned his worth. That conversation, though difficult and painful, had been transformative. It was an emotional, bittersweet liberation, difficult because he was ending something that had once promised hope, but liberating because he knew that it was the right thing to do for himself. In that moment, he was not just ending a relationship, he was reclaiming the parts of himself that had been lost, his autonomy, his respect, and his identity. A man of his own age. For so long, he had let his fears and insecurities dictate his actions. He had allowed himself to shrink in the face of hurtful behavior, all in the name of love. But now, with the wisdom that came from years of living, he understood that love should never come at the cost of one's dignity. Love was not about proving oneself to another person or losing one's sense of self in the process. It was about honoring who you were, not compromising on what you deserved. This was his moment of clarity, and it wasn't just about the woman across from him. It was about the man he was becoming, a man who, despite the years and experiences, was still worthy of love, respect, and dignity. His actions in that conversation reflected that newfound wisdom. It was as if, in that brief moment, he had grown not just in age but in spirit, becoming the man he had always been meant to be, but had not yet fully embraced. He was no longer the quiet, passive figure who had endured emotional abuse. He was a man who stood tall in his own skin, with his own identity intact. For the first time in far too long, he wasn't behaving out of fear or weakness, but out of a quiet, grounded strength. He was behaving as a man should at his age, wise, reflective, and self-aware. Embracing the passage of time, as he walked away from the conversation, he felt lighter. Though not entirely free from the memories of the years spent in that relationship, he was free from the emotional weight that had burdened him for so long. For the first time in months, he felt relief. He no longer carried the heavy burden of humiliation or self-doubt. His worth pressed down on him, but in a profoundly liberating way. He thought back on the years of his life, the triumphs, the failures, the loves, the losses. His mind raced through memories of moments that had defined him, of people who had shaped him, of the experiences that had sculpted the man he was today. Despite the wrinkles on his face, despite the gray hairs that signaled the passage of time, he realized that he was still valuable. His worth was not diminished by the years. It had only grown richer, like a fine wine that improved with age. Every wrinkle was a mark of experience, a testament to a life lived fully. Every gray hair was a symbol of wisdom, gained through trials, losses, and victories. He had endured so much, yet had never given up. The unshakable realization. It was only now, after all these years, that he understood the value of his worth. He had let himself be treated as less than worthy, less than valuable, and less than deserving of respect. He had allowed others to define his self-worth. But now, he understood that his value was not something that could be measured by anyone else's standards. It wasn't defined by her, by society, or by the expectations of others. His worth was inherent. It was in his spirit, in his heart, and in his resilience. He realized that sometimes to grow, you have to let go of things that no longer serve you, whether they be relationships, expectations, or even parts of yourself that have outlived their purpose. A new beginning. The day he left her house, he felt something shift within him. He didn't know what the future would bring, but he knew that he had chosen himself. He was no longer willing to sacrifice his dignity for anyone or anything. The future was uncertain, but the past no longer had a hold on him. He had learned that not everyone would see his worth, especially those who were only concerned with the surface. But the people who truly mattered, those who truly loved him, had always seen his essence. They had seen the real him, not the version shaped by the opinions and judgments of others. And for them, that was enough. Self-love and self-respect. As the months passed, he began to rediscover the parts of himself that had been lost, his passions, his hobbies, the things that had once filled him with joy. He reconnected with old friends, the ones who had always valued him for who he was, not for what he could offer them. He traveled to places he had always dreamed of seeing, and in each new experience, he found a renewed sense of wonder and appreciation for life. In the quiet moments of reflection, he came to understand a profound truth. A person's worth is not measured by the approval of others or by the physical changes that come with age. It is measured by the peace within, the wisdom earned through life's challenges, and the love one gives to oneself. He began to embrace his aging process, no longer viewing the passing years as something to fear, but as a testament to a life well lived. Every wrinkle, every gray hair was a reminder of the experiences he had survived, the lessons he had learned, and the strength he had gained along the way. The true meaning of love. In the end, he had learned that love is not about validation from others. True love, especially in later years, is about acceptance, about finding someone who appreciates you for who you are, imperfections and all. It's about mutual respect, support, and understanding, not about chasing fleeting moments of youthful passion. He understood now that self-respect and self-love are the cornerstones of a fulfilling life. These were not luxuries, but necessities, especially as we grow older. Self-love is what sets the tone for how we are loved by others. If we remain true to ourselves, if we honor our own worth, we can create relationships that are grounded in deep emotional connection, not in validation or the fleeting thrill of youthful romance. In the quiet depths of his heart, he finally understood what true love was. It was the love we give ourselves, and in that love, we find the strength to stand tall, to be proud of who we are, and to live a life of integrity, no matter our age.